Hey guys, it's Ian, coming at you again from the corner of my bedroom, as it's apparently the only quiet place in my house. Only problem, my dog is currently sleeping on the bed, and if you hear some angry barking halfway through this, it's probably because he's having a nightmare. He tends to do that. Sometimes he runs in his sleep in the middle of the night, which has nothing to do with anything that we're going to talk about, but just thought you'd be forewarned, okay? So this is the video to accompany the second part of our our PowerPoint on HIV and AIDS. And we're going to take a look at the history of HIV and AIDS, okay? So the history of the virus, pretty topical at the moment because we're pretty sure it started the same way the coronavirus did, okay? And that is through something called bushmeat, okay? So in Africa, common practice to eat what's referred to as bushmeat, okay? And that is, well, primates, okay? And so we're pretty sure that HIV originated, it crossed over from primates to humans sometime in the early 1900s, okay? We're not sure of an exact date. If you go back and read some articles, there's been books written about this. There's one called The River, which is about yay long. I read it a number of years ago. It goes over in crazy detail the history of HIV in Africa, okay? But we're pretty sure that it started in the Congo. Kinshasa is the name of the city. That's where we're pretty sure it started, okay? There was a railroad that went through there. There was a large sex trade that was in the city because people were coming in from all over to work in the city. And there were reports that there was this disease that was striking people, making them waste away. People were getting these illnesses that weren't common. Sounds very much like HIV and AIDS, okay? They've gone back and done like all this genetic work, which is a little beyond the scope of our course, okay? But you can kind of take genetics and work backwards and find when things veered off from each other. So we're pretty sure that it came from SIV, or simian immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. So some people in the past, and if we were in class, I would ask people, show of hands, how many people think that HIV came from someone having sex with a monkey? Okay, and there are always people who believe that, okay, and that's out there. That is not the case, okay? Just like coronavirus right now, no one had sex with a pangolin, okay? Yeah, okay, or that video of the woman eating the bat that we showed in class, okay? It's from exposure, repeated exposure, right? So what probably happened, people butchering primates, and when you're butchering something, I mean, you have an animal, you have a big knife, there's blood, you know, you cut yourself, you get this constant exposure, right, to this virus, and the virus mutates. And this happens, and viruses mutate all the time. Most of the time, there are mutations that don't obviously cause it to jump over to humans, but sometimes they do, and this is a case when that happened, okay? Same with coronavirus. We're pretty sure it came from that, what they call a wet market in Wuhan, right, where people butchering animals, you know, living in cages, blood everywhere, animal waste, people exposed to it. Viruses have chances to jump from animals to humans, okay? And that's what happened with HIV, all right? So via bushmeat. And then it spread from there, okay? We didn't actually, and if you go through the timeline on the PowerPoint, there's a really good BBC article about like 1930s in Africa. I suggest you read it. It's a good article. It'll give you a little bit more detail than what I have in the PowerPoint. I think the BBC is a pretty reputable source, right? So good article to read. It's embedded in about the third slide. of that section where we talk about early HIV in Africa. We didn't actually have the test for HIV till 1981, okay? Now, when you go through the PowerPoint, you're going to see that it's going to say, oh, first case of HIV, 1959. And then it's going to talk about something in the 60s and 70s. Okay, these tests were done after the fact. Okay, so what happened is samples were kept. Once we knew what HIV was, scientists went back and tested samples that had been kept. Okay, so the earliest positive sample that we have is from 1959. Okay, and that was pretty recently discovered. If you Google that, there's a CNN article that goes over a lot of detail. I didn't put that in the PowerPoint, but if you want, you can just Google HIV 1959, and one of the first hits that comes up is the CNN article that goes into detail how they did that, okay? But they've done this a few times. There was a teenager who lived in St. Louis who died in the late 60s. They kept tissue samples. They tested them like 20 years later in the mid-80s. Turns out he had died of HIV or AIDS, right? But had HIV. So the actual discovery of the virus was in 81. However, some of those cases that we know of as early as 59 were from samples that were tested much later, okay? We don't have any samples from early 1900s in Africa. Just wasn't kept, right? Like, not laboratories and stuff like that taking tissue samples and preserving tissue samples, okay? In 1930s Central Africa, it just wasn't a thing, right? So we're pretty sure, though, that's where it originated via the bushmeat trade, okay? So that's the early history of HIV, like a 7-minute early history, like a 7 or 8 slides in my little PowerPoint early history. There have been, like I said, massive books written on this. There's videos about it. There's documentaries about it. There's, thousands of articles about it. Okay, you can really, really, really do a deep dive on this stuff if you really, really want to. It's pretty heavy, though. It's pretty heavy slogging through how they kind of do the genetics of kind of going backwards with viruses, and you look at mutation rates, and that's when they can see when viruses, kind of separated from each other. So, if that interests you, I would suggest go into, genetics and stuff like that in university, right? And you'll really get into the nuts and bolts of that. For the purposes of this course, just basically what I've covered, okay? And that's the real simple, dirty, simplified history of this, okay? So let's jump into the 1980s and let's talk about a couple of people, okay? I spent a couple of slides talking about an Air Canada flight attendant, Gaetan Dugas, or Duguay, depending on your French pronunciation. Mine's not awesome, okay? He was known as Patient Zero, okay? And pardon me for looking down. I took a bunch of notes here, okay? So I'd have some talking points. He was, like I said, a flight attendant for Air Canada, and he was widely, in the 80s, kind of recognized or named as Patient Zero. He was the guy who brought HIV to North America and spread it everywhere, okay? Not the case, all right? Embedded in your PowerPoint, okay, there's going to be a couple of newspaper articles as well as a CBC article talking about him in detail. What happened in the 80s? HBO, okay, the American channel, right? Game of Thrones, all that sort of stuff, great shows. They had a made-for-TV movie called And the Band Played On, all right? It was originally a book. And that book was written by a gentleman from San Francisco who really chronicled the early spread of HIV in North America, okay? And if you want, you can Google that. It's actually on YouTube. There's some kind of famous actors in it and stuff. It's pretty good, okay? It's a pretty good movie. The only problem with it is they really portray him as a bad guy, all right? When, as a matter of fact, he really wasn't a bad guy. Was he promiscuous? Yes. Okay. Was he a gay man? Yes. Did he have HIV? Yes. Did he give people HIV? Absolutely. Okay. But he wasn't a monster. He wasn't going around doing this on purpose. He was actually quite helpful with the CDC in the end. And he's known as Patient Zero, but that's a misnomer. There was recently an article done about him, a documentary done about him, when they were creating this flow chart to see all of the people who had contracted HIV. What they did is they were looking at an area in the United States, okay? And they kind of labeled people. You'll see in my PowerPoint, you kind of have like this, almost looks like a mind map, right? Of people that were infected. And he's in there, and he's labeled patient 0, okay? But in fact, it's not patient 0, it's patient O, like the letter O, because he was from outside of the area. But when people saw that, they saw patient 0 as if he was the epicenter of the entire spread of HIV. So for years, because of that, because of this book, because of this miniserie or this made-for-TV movie on HBO that was really their first really big movie that was widely seen, and in that movie he's portrayed as this kind of, bad guy, right? He was always seen as being the person that spread it everywhere, and not the case, right? So I invite you to go and read or I believe it's a CBC, it's a CBC radio article with someone who knew him, and kind of get the real story on that. And like I said, if you want to watch that video, it is on, you can find it on YouTube. It's about a 2-hour movie. It's not too long. It is quite interesting, but just take it with a grain of salt, right? It was made at a time when, like we talked about, people were terrified, right? People thought you could get HIV from kissing, from hugging, from sharing a toilet seat. Early on, remember, HIV was a gay man's disease, right? Its original name wasn't HIV. It was like GERD, G-I-R-D, like gay-related, right? Like it was seen as this gay man's plague sort of thing. And it wasn't until it spread around a little bit where people realized, oh, it's not just gay men that are getting it. Heterosexual people and also non-gay men were getting it as well, okay? Now, in the PowerPoint, I go over kind of the history of testing, and a lot of this is going to be about the United States, okay? The CDC in the United States, really the epicenter of this was in the United States, California, New York, okay? So a lot of the early stuff was, in my PowerPoint, I talk about the CDC in the United States a lot, the history of when we kind of had records of this, okay? In the 80s, right, when they were, when they were putting out warnings and stuff, blood banks were, early on not testing for this, right? They were accepting blood from people that were HIV positive. Now, they weren't testing, they didn't know, but it took a few years till they actually put testing in. And you actually, if you were a gay man, you were not allowed to donate blood. That was one of the questions they asked you on the kind of blood form. And I remember when I was younger, the first time you gave blood, I don't know if any of you guys have. If you haven't and you're of age, you should. It's a good thing, right? That was one of the questions, right? It was like, are you gay? Or have you, I don't remember the exact word, have you had gay sex? And if you had, you were immediately disqualified. They've recently changed that, right? They made it, have you had sex, same-sex sex in the last year, right? They actually made it so that you could donate. And there's people still against that, right? But the numbers are higher in the gay community than they are in the heterosexual community. But, they do test the blood, right? Like maybe you'd have a bigger donor pool if you allowed people that were gay to donate blood freely, right? I mean, we test it all anyways. But that's something we're going to talk about when we get into our public health unit in a little more detail, right? And we'll kind of do a deep dive into that and your guys' opinion on that, okay? So there's a bunch of slides on just kind of the history. In the 80s, remember, we talked about new drugs now. People live 10 plus years. Some people live 20, 30 years. In the 80s, it was like less than a year and a half from diagnosis to death, right? Mid 80s, if you got HIV, you were dead within a year and a half. So the modern drugs we've created have really expanded that, 15 months to 15, 20, 30 years, right? So we've come a long way with our drugs that we have now. Okay, the last part of the PowerPoint, and I'm just going to do this now for sake of time, okay? If we get to 20 minutes and we're done, I go over a few people, okay? And a few people that really, really, really made an impact on the general population in the 1980s and early 90s. The first person I mentioned in there is a boy named Ryan White. Okay, and Ryan White was a hemophiliac, which means his blood doesn't clot, right? So if you get a cut, normally, right, you get a cut, your platelets in your blood clot up that cut, and so you stop bleeding. Hemophilia, you don't have platelets. Platelets don't work. So if when you get a cut, you keep bleeding. So the most common treatment for that, if you're a hemophiliac, is you get basically like platelets. So people donate blood, they take the platelets out, and they can give them to you if you're a hemophiliac, right? And then your blood will clot. So remember, they weren't testing blood, okay? So in the early 80s, Ryan White got a blood transfusion and he contracted HIV, okay? And his story's kind of sad, right? And again, they made a made-for-TV movie about him. If you Google the Ryan White story, you can watch it. I vividly remember this from when I was a kid and remember watching it. And he basically got kicked out of his high school, had all these problems, but he became a celebrity, right? People like Elton John and Michael Jackson and a who's who of the 1980s kind of celebrities rallied around him, okay? And it was a really, really big deal. So when you get to the slide on him, there's a couple of embedded links in there I'd love you to take a look at. Again, I did not put the link to the YouTube movie about him. If you'd like to watch it, okay, Ryan White story on YouTube. I'm going to warn you right now, it's 80s. Big hair, high jeans, but besides that, it's the story about him, and not going to lie, you're going to watch it and you're going to be a little bit angry at people. Because of what we know now, you're going to look back and be like, oh my God, how could they have done that? Right? To this completely innocent kid who did absolutely nothing wrong, right? Was born with hemophilia and ends up with HIV. So yeah, over the Easter weekend, I invite you to watch that one as well, okay? It's a good one. All right, the next one in there is an actor that you guys will never have heard of, okay? And that's Rock Hudson, okay? Please, please, please. I put a YouTube clip in there that you have to watch, okay? It is the trailer from a movie called Giant, and it is starring Rock Hudson, Elizabeth Taylor, and a very young James Dean, who you will recognize when you see him, even if you don't know the name. Rock Hudson was like the biggest movie star of the post-World War II, 50s, 60s. And you'll see the picture I post in the hub on the PowerPoint, right? He is a handsome man. He was the man that, that old saying, men want to be and women want to be with. That was Rock Hudson, right? He was a Hollywood sex symbol. He was a man's man. And turns out he was also gay and lived a very closeted lifestyle because he was a Hollywood movie star. And he ended up getting HIV and dying of AIDS. It didn't come out till the very, very end that he was gay and had AIDS, when he was quite ill. I invite you to look into a little bit on him. Elizabeth Taylor, who's now dead, she was arguably the greatest or biggest movie star ever. She was lifelong friends with him. She started a huge AIDS charity. The Red Ribbons, that's Elizabeth Taylor, right? That we still see today. I put a link to, it's called AMFAR. You can take a look at their website and see all the money they've raised and donated and things like that over the years, okay? So take a look at him. Please watch the YouTube clip. Like, golden age of Hollywood at his best. Like, unbelievable. And, yeah, like, you'll see the picture. He's a handsome man. Liberace, you have no idea who he is. He was like this Las Vegas entertainer. He died of AIDS. Again, no one knew he was gay. And you'll play it, right? There's a YouTube clip of him playing some music. And again, they're just a celebrity in the 80s. This was, again, you won't know who this is. When I was a kid, everyone knew who Liberace was, okay? So you'll see. Just watch the YouTube clip. Princess Diana, I mentioned in here, okay? And there's an article about Princess Diana. And you guys won't remember when she died. I still remember when she died. And now I'm going way long, and I'm trying to stay on topic, but like, Princess Diana was like everyone loved her, right? And I'll never forget when she died. But everyone loved her, and there are a couple of pictures that I've posted in the PowerPoint, and there's a link to an article about her. And in the 80s, she was at like this orphanage, and she was holding this child that had HIV. And there's pictures of her shaking hands with people with HIV. And at the time, that was like unheard of. Like, people still thought, like we said, you could get it from touching someone. And here's Princess Diana, like, shaking their hands, holding a child, doing these things. It's hard to describe, like, almost getting goosebumps, right? It's hard to describe how loved she was by the people, right? And why there was, even though she had divorced Prince Charles, why the world, like, mourned when she died, right? Is because she was such a, like, humanitarian. Yeah, I invite you to read that article. Yeah, you'll see, right? Just give it a try, okay? Three other people I want to mention. There's a slide in there of a pop artist, okay, that I want you to take a look at. One of my favorite artists. You know what? I'm going to leave it at that. You can go into that. You'll see. You'll like it, I hope. And again, you can do a super deep dive on him. Google his name, lots of YouTube videos, right? And you'll recognize his art when you see it. I'm just going to leave it at that. Last two people I want to mention, Magic Johnson, okay? Magic, I'll never forget. In the early 90s, he came out and said he was HIV positive, and he had to retire from the NBA. And for those of you who don't know, Magic Johnson was like imagine LeBron James came out and said, I have HIV, right? Like, but even worse, because at this point, HIV was still, early 90s, still associated with drug addicts and gay men. Like, Magic Johnson was the greatest basketball player. Like, him and Larry Bird, all of the 80s, right? Michael Jordan. Like, Magic, right? Was pictures of him at the Playboy Mansion. And he's got HIV. Like, I mean, it turned the world on its ear. And as a teenager, I remember me and my friends like, well, like the first thing you think is, oh my God, Magic Johnson's gay. Or Magic Johnson's on heroin, right? Like, no, he was married. He had kids. It was mind-blowing, right? It was I still remember it to this day. I remember talking to my dad about it. And, yeah, like, it's hard for me almost to get out the words about it, like how it made me feel. Like, it really made everyone think differently in so many ways, that it wasn't just this, poor drug addict, gay, all these things, for me anyways, right? And I mean, I grew up, maybe in a bit of a household where, there were some, how do I say it nicely, biases, yeah, it really made everyone think totally different. And I'll never forget. I remember watching it on TV, and I remember just how I just remember, right? Like the biggest sports star having this disease. Like, it was unbelievable, right? Anyways, I've put some links to it on the hub as well. I went way longer than I wanted to. So what I'd like you to do is just go over the last half of that PowerPoint, watch this video, and like I said, try to watch a couple of movies if you have time. Ryan White's story, okay? That's a good one, okay? It's on the YouTube. Yeah, okay. So that's it for now. Signing off for today. I'll have one more message this week before Easter. And yeah, have a great evening. And like I said, make some notes. Click on all the links. Do a couple of deep dives if you want. And we'll go from there. All right, guys. I miss you. I think we're going to do an Instagram Live early next week. And we'll see how that goes. Okay, gang. So long for now.